Within the last couple years, we have begun to see a new upward trend of state versus state conflicts. This may actually be concerning to many people after we have just spent the last 2 decades fighting a war on terror. And over these last 2 decades, when it comes to military affairs and conflict resolution, everything's been primarily aimed at combating terrorist groups and insurgency groups. After spending these last 2 decades kind of fighting just terrorist groups and non-state actors, when we see this new upward trend of other states fighting other states, it makes sense why the world would begin to worry. I mean, we have all witnessed in 2022 when Russia conducted a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And throughout 2020 and 2021, we have seen ongoing conflicts and clashes between that of Azerbaijan and Armenia. And even outside this former Soviet region, we're even seeing ongoing threats of China to that of Taiwan. Even with this current upward trend of state versus state conflicts, most of the world's conflicts are actually still involving that of insurgency groups and terrorist groups. And while we are seeing this upward trend of state versus state conflict, it is still important to note that insurgencies and terrorism still play a role in these conflicts themselves. Let's even take Ukraine for example, where we look at the Donbass region where we still see insurgency groups fighting the Ukrainian military right there at this very moment. While these rebel groups in the Donbass region are not directly affiliated with any state, whether that be Ukraine or Russia, they still play a massive role within the ongoing war in Ukraine. But needless to say that rebel groups, insurgency groups, and terrorist groups, they're still a great security concern to ongoing conflicts, and we should still be focusing on them rather than just state versus state conflicts. Before we get into the meat of the video, let's first try to describe what a terrorist is. Essentially, the issue with defining what a terrorist is that there is no actual universal definition for terrorist or terrorism. I mean, the closest thing that we have is this UN definition. However, it still has its own flaws, which essentially made it difficult for them to actually implement the definition. This is due to states not agreeing on what defines terrorism, and it just creates this weird convoluted situation in which a state would accuse another state of being a terrorist because they fit the criteria for this as well, and it doesn't really distinguish that of non-state actors from state actors, which I would argue in this video that is one of the most important elements of defining a terrorist group or a terrorist, is that you have to distinguish between state actors and non-state actors. We also see other terms essentially get thrown around that people kind of use synonymously with terrorist and terrorism. We see people mention guerrilla and guerrilla warfare, paramilitaries, violent non-state actors, violent extremists, and terrorists. But in reality, these definitions are all extremely different and describe different things, and because they are different, we can't really use them as synonyms for terrorism. And I will further explain this by showing you the definitions of these other terms. So one term a lot of people use is that of a guerrilla or guerrilla warfare, but we're going to go off the Wikipedia definition of what a guerrilla is. A guerrilla is an individual or group engaged in irregular warfare and combat. Right off the bat, we already have some concerns with this definition and whether or not we could use them as a synonym for terrorism. And the main reason is that this definition just says that a guerrilla is a group that engages in irregular warfare. That doesn't really separate non-state actors from state actors. For example, let's pose a hypothetical. Let's say for some weird reason the United States and Canada go to war. Their soldiers are actively engaging in a battle at Niagara Falls, let's say. If one side decided to use more unconventional military means to fight the other, that would make them a guerrilla. They would be a guerrilla just because they are practicing irregular warfare, essentially unconventional means of warfare. But this still doesn't change that they are still a state-affiliated soldier, where typically terrorism is a non-state actor. So we can't really use this definition for terrorism. Now let's look at another term that people kind of use synonymously with terrorism, and that is that of paramilitary. A paramilitary is an organization whose structure, tactics, training, and function are often similar to those of a professional military, but which is not part of a country's official or legitimate armed forces. And again, here we kind of run into the same problem that we had with the guerrilla definition. That is that paramilitary still does not separate state from non-state actors. In all technicality, if a police force is using military-grade equipment, that would make them a paramilitary. Any gendarmerie group, such as the gendarmerie forces in France, would be considered paramilitary. I mean, there's even some Boy Scout groups within the United States that can be considered a paramilitary. So once again, this definition doesn't really help us with understanding what terrorism is. Another long term that people use synonymously with that of terrorism is violent non-state actors. Violent non-state actors are individuals or groups that are wholly or partly independent of governments and which threaten or use violence in order to achieve their goals. I do believe that this is one of the better definitions that can adequately describe terrorism. One of the reasonings why this term is one of the better terms to use is that it separates that of state actors from non-state actors. However, it does not distinguish that of terrorism from, let's say, other groups like transnational crime organizations or cartels. While we can certainly recognize that transnational crime organizations and cartels are just as violent as that of terrorist groups, we still have to recognize that there is a difference in the way that they function and the reasonings why they conduct the acts that they do. Typically, terrorism is conducted for either religious, socio-political, or ideological reasonings, where cartels and transnational crime organizations are just solely based off money.
All you care about is money.
So let's now look at the Wikipedia definition for terrorism itself, and let's see if that is better than any of the previous definitions that we've already listed. The Wikipedia definition for a terrorist is an individual or organization that terrorizes the masses through intentional violence and fear in order to achieve political and/or ideological aims. Now, when most of you guys hear this definition, I guarantee that most of you guys would agree that this is a pretty adequate definition for that of a terrorist group. However, here's another issue that is a similar issue that we've had with many of the other definitions that we have mentioned previously, and it's that it does not separate that of state actors from non-state actors. While I'm sure many of us can all agree that many countries conduct very heinous acts that could be compared to that of terrorism, but for law enforcement and counterterrorism purposes, we do need a more adequate definition for that of terrorism, in which the term terrorism has essentially become its own form of political jargon nowadays, kind of just being thrown around everywhere and losing its meaning over time. So in order to ensure that this term does not lose its meaning, we need to find a more adequate definition for the term. So based off the previous definitions that we've already mentioned, such as guerrilla, paramilitary, violent non-state actors, and terrorism, I've created my own term and definition that I believe would actually be better fit to describing terrorism for counterterrorism purposes. That being of violent non-state guerrilla organization or actor. Very long, it's a very long term, but I do believe that this term makes more sense, and so will the definition I'm about to explain. The definition for violent non-state guerrilla organization / actor is a group or individual that is wholly or partially independent of governments and which engages in irregular warfare and violence in order to achieve political and/or ideological goals. As you can see, I essentially took the best qualities of all those previously mentioned definitions. Within this definition, we were able to separate state actors from non-state actors. We were able to hit that they engage in irregular warfare. And lastly, we're able to hit that their goals are ultimately either political or ideological. I do believe that my term would be very beneficial for counterterrorism purposes and also just identifying what exactly a terrorist group is. And I will show you that this term would be beneficial when we go over other types of terrorist organizations. And just so you guys know, for the remainder of this video, whenever I refer to the word terrorist or terrorism, I am referring to my own definition of such. So when you hear the terms terrorist or terrorism, think in your mind violent non-state guerrilla organizations / individuals. So now that we have a proper term for that of terrorist and terrorism, let's go into the second portion of this video. While we do have a more concrete term for that of terrorism, we also must acknowledge that terrorist groups are not all the same. In fact, every single group is extremely different from one another. Where there are some groups that actually act in a similar manner to that of states and countries, and other groups just act like wild animals throwing their around everywhere. Needless to say, when you have a wide variety of terrorist groups, this singular definition just works as an overarching branch between them all, but we still must distinguish each group from one another. And this is where I get into a categorization of terrorist groups. While there are many types of terrorist groups, all terrorist groups usually fit into two different types of categories, that of revolutionary terrorist groups and that of sub-revolutionary terrorist groups. Now let me go into this Canva presentation in which I can better adequately explain the difference between these two different types of terrorist groups, in which I will also give you examples of terrorist groups that fall into these different categories. Okay, we're now going to go into the different types of terrorist groups. First, we have revolutionary terrorist groups. And secondly, we have sub-revolutionary terrorist groups. So what exactly distinguishes a revolutionary terrorist group from a sub-revolutionary terrorist group? Well, let's first dive into the revolutionary terrorist groups and describe its characteristics. For one, revolutionary terrorist groups seek the complete abolition of an existing political system and its replacement with an entirely new structure. Revolutionary terrorist groups also lack the ability to negotiate and conduct meaningful dialogue with other states. Revolutionary terrorist groups also do not typically represent a specific group of people, such as a specific ethnic group, a specific tribal group, or a specific people group within a country and/or nation. What I mean by this is that revolutionary terrorist groups would claim to represent an entire global population or an entire religious group, which is just unrealistic when you're trying to fight for a specific cause. You can't fight for everyone, because if you're fighting for everyone, you're not really fighting for anyone. Revolutionary terrorist groups are also the most violent type of terrorist group. They prioritize violence over that of state-like functions such as dialogue or negotiations. Examples of revolutionary terrorist groups would be groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Shining Path from Peru, and Al-Shabaab. So now that we got an overview of revolutionary terrorist groups, let's now go into sub-revolutionary terrorist groups. Sub-revolutionary terrorist groups differentiate from that of revolutionary terrorist groups, as in they seek to modify existing socio-political structures rather than a complete abolition of such. Because their main goal is to modify an existing socio-political structure, they thus have the ability to conduct dialogue and negotiate with their host state. However, because they are still a terrorist group, they still can conduct and use violence as a means of protocol if they deem it necessary. Sub-revolutionary terrorist groups also typically represent a disenfranchised and/or underrepresented people group within an existing political structure. This can stem from cultural reasonings, historic reasonings, and also post-colonialism, and many more other reasons for why a certain group within a country can be disenfranchised and/or underrepresented. Sub-revolutionary groups also differentiate from revolutionary terrorist groups in that they act in a similar manner to that of a state, but they just lack the legitimacy of a state. This stems from the political nature of these types of terrorist groups, in which they have the ability to conduct dialogue and conduct political stances. We have seen this with the group such as FARC within Colombia, where we actually saw the group put down their arms and join the Colombian government within its own party. Examples of sub-revolutionary terrorist groups would be like that of Hamas, FARC, Hezbollah, the PKK, and the Taliban before they took over the country of Afghanistan. So now that we know the difference between revolutionary terrorist groups and sub-revolutionary terrorist groups, here are some other things to note when we go about talking about these two types of terrorist groups. For starters, nearly every single type of terrorist group starts off as a revolutionary terrorist group, in which some of them eventually evolve into being that of sub-revolutionary terrorist groups. Secondly, most active terrorist groups right now are actually revolutionary terrorist groups. And when we take a look at the 53 designated terrorist groups by the United Nations Security Council Committee, only 3 of these groups can potentially be seen as sub-revolutionary terrorist groups. And when we look at the US list of designated terrorist groups, 16 out of the 69 total groups can be potentially seen as sub-revolutionary terrorist groups, whereas 45 out of these 69 are seen as revolutionary terrorist groups. However, out of the US list of designated terrorist groups, 4 out of these groups actually do not really fit the classification of any terrorist group or category. These 4 terrorist groups are actually just offshoots of another country's military. 2 of them being offshoots of the Iraqi military, which I guess act in their own quasi-independence from the rest of the Iraqi military, but they are still under the Iraqi military nonetheless. Another one of them is just an Iranian proxy group in that of Bahrain, but the group is actually just linked to being part of the Iranian military in general, so even then it doesn't really fit. And the other one is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is just a branch of the Iranian military, which the United States just designated them as a terrorist group for political purposes. Funny enough, this actually ended up leading to Iran designating the entire US armed forces as a terrorist group within Iran. And I'm sure we can all agree that a country designating another country's armed forces as a terrorist group is really just political jargon. And this kind of just reflects on my previous points on why we need a universal definition for terrorism in order to prevent countries from just throwing it around as this junky political term instead of any legitimacy. So now, after seeing the presentation of the categorization of terrorist groups, and also seeing my proposed definition for that of terrorism, you can see how both the categorization and the proposed definition would be beneficial to counterterrorism purposes, as it allows us to actually go deeper into the understanding of each terrorist group individually, which can then allow us to properly engage and or combat said terrorist group. It would just overall be a lot more effective. And it is important to note that conflicts are constantly evolving and changing and are complex in their own nature, but sometimes even something as simple as a new reapproachment to even a categorization of a terrorist group could be a lot more effective in the long run. I mean, most countries have a list of groups that they recognize as terrorist groups, and some countries have more power to actually combat and counter these groups better than others. For example, the United States. The United States has by far the greatest capability to actually implement this said categorization system within its counterterrorism policy. And it's actually one of the few countries that actually has the capability to make a shift and a change in the way terrorism is approached globally. And the thing is, we've already seen the United States already adopt some of these tactics on their own, in which the United States conducted not peace talks but dialogue with the Taliban in order to essentially negotiate a better exit strategy for the United States by minimizing both casualties between that of the Taliban and the United States Armed Forces. While in the case of the United States and the Taliban, it was a mess, but it does show that the United States has the capability of conducting policies that could be based on this classification method. The only thing is, the United States doesn't actually have an official classification method. I mean, the Taliban situation was just situational. But the United States essentially moving past this "we don't negotiate with terrorism" strategy.
We don't negotiate with terrorists.
And essentially recognizing that the Taliban is not the same as something like ISIS, has allowed for the United States to achieve some sort of favorable terms on how it exited from Afghanistan. This means that the United States does in fact have the capability to approach other terrorist groups differently, rather than just sending lead downstream. And having the capability to distinguish one group from another can actually be beneficial for the United States, the group in question, and the host country in which the group resides. So now that's all that's left to do is for the United States to actually officially implement a classification strategy within its counterterrorism policy. And if the United States does such, we can actually potentially see a better global situation when it comes to combating insurgency, as we would now have a new counterterrorism method on the table. However, I know many people would not support that idea, and I 100% do not blame you if you do not support that as well. For many people, I know that this is an emotional topic, and the idea of negotiating with any group that could be perceived as a terrorist group is just no, off the limits, off the table, in which is perfectly understandable. However, I am just looking at this from a counterterrorism perspective and looking at other case studies such as the Taliban case, in which this strategy, while controversial, it did kind of work. And also keep this in mind, if the United States for some reason decided to actually go about implementing this classification system, it would be a lot more complex and specific in how they do such.